The morning of September 2nd, 1944 brought an uneasy stillness to the fields outside Maizi, France. Oberleutnant Werner Schulz watched from his Panther tank's commander cupola as early autumn mist clung to the hedgerows like funeral shrouds. At 28 years old, Schulz had commanded Panthers for 14 months, from the killing fields of Kursk to this desperate fighting withdrawal across France. His crew trusted the Panther absolutely. The tank's sloped frontal armor, 80 millimeters thick at 55 degrees, had deflected dozens of American shells without so much as a crack in the steel. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Schulz had seen 3 American Shermans burn trying to knock out his Panther near Mortain just weeks earlier. Their 75mm rounds had sparked harmlessly off his glacis plate like match strikes on wet stone. The mathematical certainty of German armor superiority had become doctrine, psychology, survival instinct, all compressed into 45 tons of Krupp steel. Yet something had changed in the American formations over the past 10 days, something Schulz's intelligence officers couldn't explain and his superiors refused to acknowledge. Panzer crews were reporting impossible kills, Shermans destroying Panthers from the front at ranges where such penetrations should have been physically impossible. The 76mm gun the Americans had introduced in June had proven only marginally better than their old 75. Schulz himself had survived 4 direct hits from a 76mm Sherman during a firefight near Argentan. Each shot had failed to penetrate, leaving only scorch marks on his frontal armor. Yet in the village of Domi 3 days ago, an entire Zug of Panthers, 4 tanks from the 2nd Panzer Division, had been destroyed in less than 5 minutes by American Shermans engaging from prepared positions. The survivors described something new, something that penetrated frontal armor as if it were cardboard. Schulz studied the tactical map spread across his tank's engine deck, his finger tracing the thin red line marking his company's defensive position. Intelligence reported a full American armored battalion advancing along the Nancy Road, at least 40 Shermans supported by infantry and artillery. The German defensive doctrine for such engagements had been refined through bitter experience. Panthers would engage from hull-down positions at maximum range, typically 1,200 to 1,500 meters, where their superior optics and powerful 75mm KK-42 gun could destroy Shermans before American guns could effectively return fire. The mathematics had always favored the defender. A concealed Panther could typically destroy 3 to 5 Shermans before American forces could coordinate effective counter-battery fire or flank the position. Then the Panthers would withdraw to the next defensive line, repeat the process, buy time for what remained of the Wehrmacht to escape eastward toward the German frontier. But the new American ammunition, whatever it was, had invalidated these calculations. Schulz's company commander, Hauptmann Friedrich Hoffmann, had issued new tactical guidance that morning: engage at maximum possible range, destroy targets quickly, and withdraw immediately if the Americans returned accurate fire. The orders implicitly acknowledged what no one wanted to say aloud: the Panthers' invulnerability could no longer be assumed. 3,000 miles away, in the sprawling industrial complex of the Watertown Arsenal in Massachusetts, the technical revolution that would shatter German armored doctrine had been achieved through metallurgy, mathematics, and desperate necessity. Dr. James Sullivan, chief of the armor-piercing projectile section, stood in the ballistics testing bunker, examining the latest penetration results for the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing round. The tungsten carbide penetrator, measuring just 3 inches in length and weighing slightly over 2 pounds, had punched through a captured Panther glacis plate at 1,000 yards as cleanly as an awl through leather. Sullivan had worked on armor-piercing ammunition development since 1941, watching his early tungsten core designs languish in experimental limbo due to material shortages and production challenges. The tungsten required for these projectiles, a strategic material also needed for machine tools and electronics, had been rationed so severely that pre-war ammunition programs could produce only small quantities for testing. Everything changed after Normandy. American tank crews were dying in numbers that shocked even veteran commanders accustomed to the brutal arithmetic of armored warfare. The standard 75mm gun, equipped on most Shermans, simply could not penetrate Panther frontal armor at combat ranges. Even the improved 76mm gun, rushed into production and fielded starting in June 1944, proved inadequate against the Panther's thick, steeply sloped frontal plate. The Army Ordnance Department's after-action analysis from July battles in Normandy documented the crisis with painful clarity. Sherman crews typically required flanking shots or ambush tactics to destroy Panthers, tactics that took time, coordination, and casualties the American Army could not sustain. Technical Sergeant James Morrison, a tank commander in the 2nd Armored Division, had filed one of the hundreds of urgent combat reports that eventually reached Sullivan's desk. Morrison described watching his platoon leader's Sherman take 9 direct hits on a Panther's frontal armor during a firefight near St. Lo. Each 76mm armor-piercing round had sparked off the German steel without penetrating. The Panther had methodically destroyed all 4 Shermans in Morrison's platoon before withdrawing undamaged. Morrison survived only because his loader had been killed instantly by a shell fragment, causing Morrison to abandon his tank before the Panther's gunner could fire again. Sullivan understood that solving the penetration problem required more than simply making projectiles harder or heavier. The physics of armor penetration depended on kinetic energy, impact velocity, and the projectile's ability to concentrate force onto the smallest possible impact area. Steel-cored armor-piercing rounds, even those fired at higher velocities from the 76mm gun, simply could not generate sufficient penetrating power against face-hardened armor plates, 80mm thick, set at steep angles. The solution lay in exotic materials and innovative design. The M93 HVAP round featured a tungsten carbide core surrounded by an aluminum ballistic cap and steel jacket. The aluminum cap fell away after leaving the barrel, reducing air resistance and allowing the dense tungsten penetrator to maintain velocity. Upon impact, the tungsten core, significantly harder and denser than steel, would punch through armor by concentrating enormous force onto a tiny impact point measured in square millimeters. According to testing data from the Aberdeen Proving Ground, documented in United States Army Ordnance Department Technical Bulletin 43 from August 1944, the M93 round achieved muzzle velocities of 3,400 feet per second from the 76mm M1A1 gun. This velocity, combined with the tungsten penetrator's density and hardness, enabled penetration of approximately 4 inches of homogeneous armor plate at 1,000 yards, sufficient to defeat the Panther's frontal armor at typical engagement ranges. The technical challenges in producing HVAP ammunition were substantial. Tungsten carbide, while incredibly hard, was also brittle. Manufacturing penetrators that wouldn't shatter on impact required precise control of grain size, bonding agents, and heat treatment. The aluminum ballistic caps had to be machined to, exacting tolerances to ensure they separated cleanly after leaving the barrel. Production bottlenecks, material shortages, and quality control issues limited initial output to a fraction of what frontline tank units required. By mid-August 1944, the first substantial shipments of M93 HVAP ammunition reached forward supply depots in France. Each 76mm Sherman received an initial allocation of just 4 rounds, a testament both to the ammunition's scarcity and its precious value. Tank battalion commanders received explicit orders. HVAP was for Panthers and Tigers only, no exceptions, no waste. The ammunition's tactical implications were immediately recognized by officers who understood armored warfare's brutal mathematics. Captain Robert Hayes, commanding officer of B Company, 66th Armored Regiment, briefed his tank commanders on HVAP employment during a hasty assembly in an apple orchard near Argentan. Hayes, a pre-war cavalry officer who had converted to armor, understood that HVAP represented more than just improved ammunition. It was psychological transformation compressed into a 15-pound projectile. For 8 weeks, his Sherman crews had fought Panthers, knowing that frontal engagements meant probable death. Standard doctrine called for elaborate flanking maneuvers, infantry support to suppress German anti-tank guns, and artillery preparation before engaging heavy German armor. These tactics worked, eventually, but they consumed time and lives with merciless efficiency. HVAP changed the equation fundamentally. A Sherman with properly aimed HVAP could kill a Panther frontally at ranges where previous ammunition had been useless. This capability didn't just improve American combat effectiveness, it transformed the psychological dynamic of armored combat. Staff Sergeant Thomas Wei Chen, a gunner in Hayes's company, examined his 4 allocated HVAP rounds with something approaching reverence. Chen had enlisted in March 1942, trained at Fort Knox, and arrived in Europe in time for the Normandy breakout. His original crew had been killed at Carentan when a Panther destroyed their Sherman with a single shot that penetrated the turret and detonated the ammunition stowage. Chen had been outside the tank conducting reconnaissance when the hit occurred. He'd watched 4 friends burn to death in a steel coffin whose armor might as well have been paper. Survival had left Chen with recurring nightmares and an almost paralyzing fear of engaging Panthers. His new crew, assembled from replacements and survivors of other destroyed tanks, shared similar psychological scars. The arrival of HVAP ammunition didn't erase that trauma, but it offered something Chen hadn't felt in months. Hope. His loader, Corporal Michael Nowak, carefully stowed the 4 HVAP rounds in the ready rack, marking them with distinctive red tape to ensure instant identification during combat. The tactical employment of HVAP required more than simply loading the ammunition and firing. The round's higher velocity meant slightly different ballistics than standard armor-piercing ammunition. Gunners had to adjust their ranging and aim points, particularly at longer distances. More critically, HVAP's penetration capability depended heavily on striking armor at near-perpendicular angles. The tungsten penetrator's brittleness meant that hitting steeply sloped armor at extreme angles could cause the core to shatter rather than penetrate. Training sessions emphasized these technical considerations, drilling gunners on precise target identification and optimal shot placement. With only 4 rounds per tank, there was zero margin for error or wasted shots. The ammunition had to count every single time. By early September, American armored units operating across France had incorporated HVAP into their tactical doctrine. Sherman companies advancing through German defensive positions now engaged Panthers with new confidence, knowing that their opening shots stood reasonable chances of penetration rather than futile, sparking off invulnerable armor. The transformation in American tactical performance was measurable and dramatic. According to operational analysis conducted by 1st Army staff, Sherman units equipped with 76mm guns and HVAP ammunition achieved kill-to-loss ratios against Panthers that approached parity, a radical improvement from the catastrophic losses documented in July. German intelligence services struggled to understand what had changed in American armored formations. Interrogations of captured American tank crew produced fragmentary and confusing reports. Some prisoners mentioned new ammunition, others denied any equipment changes. A few claimed the improved performance stemmed from better training and tactics. Wehrmacht commanders, facing strategic collapse across the Western Front, had little time or resources to investigate mysterious American ammunition improvements. Their immediate concern was survival, conducting fighting withdrawals while preserving what remained of Germany's armored forces for the inevitable battles on German soil. Oberleutnant Schulz, waiting in his hull-down Panther position outside Maizi, represented the sharp end of this intelligence failure. He knew American tactics intimately, understood Sherman capabilities, and trusted his Panther's armor absolutely. What he didn't know, what German intelligence hadn't adequately communicated, was that the fundamental assumptions underlying German armored doctrine had been invalidated by a 3-inch tungsten penetrator. The morning silence broke at 9:37 hours when Schulz's radio operator reported American armor approaching from the west. Schulz raised his binoculars, scanning the tree line 1,400 meters distant where the Nancy Road emerged from forest into open farmland. The first Shermans appeared moments later, advancing in tactical formation with infantry support visible in the fields. Schulz counted quickly. 12, 15, perhaps 20 Shermans, several with the longer-barreled 76mm guns that had proven only marginally more dangerous than the old 75 seconds. His gunner, Unteroffizier Hans Becker, already had the first Sherman in his sights. The Panther's optics were superb, German optical engineering providing clarity at ranges where American optics struggled. Becker could clearly see the tank commander in the lead Sherman's turret, scanning with binoculars, apparently unaware of the Panther's concealed 1,400 meters ahead. Standard doctrine called for letting the American column advance to optimal range, approximately 1,000 to 1,200 meters, where the Panther's 75mm KK-42 gun would guarantee first-round kills. Schulz gave the fire command, his voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking through his system. The range was perfect, conditions ideal, and his crew had destroyed more than a dozen Shermans using exactly this tactical setup. Everything about the engagement followed predictable patterns, refined through months of combat. Yet in the 90 seconds between when Becker centered his crosshairs on that lead Sherman and when the American tank fired back, the entire calculus of armored warfare in Europe would be permanently altered. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Panther's 75mm gun fired with the distinctive crack that Schulz had heard hundreds of times. The recoil rocked the 45-ton tank slightly as the armor-piercing round streaked downrange at 3,000 feet per second. Through his optics, Becker watched the tracer arc toward the lead Sherman with practiced certainty. The round struck the Sherman's frontal slope perfectly, but instead of the expected catastrophic penetration and ammunition detonation, the shell ricocheted off at a sharp angle, leaving a bright gouge in the American armor. Becker's professional composure cracked for an instant. At 1,200 meters, that shot should have killed the Sherman absolutely. The American tank, rather than brewing up in the familiar orange fireball, simply stopped, its turret traversing with deliberate purpose toward Schulz's concealed position. What happened next would be seared into Schulz's memory for the rest of his life, the 90 seconds that destroyed his understanding of armored warfare. The Sherman's 76mm gun fired. The report was sharper than Schulz expected, the muzzle blast more pronounced. The round's flight seemed impossibly fast, covering 1,200 meters in less time than Schulz's brain could process the threat. The projectile struck the Panther's frontal glacis plate slightly left of center, precisely where 80mm of face-hardened armor set at 55 degrees had deflected dozens of previous American rounds without damage. This time, the tungsten carbide penetrator of the M93 HVAP round concentrated 3,400 feet per second of kinetic energy onto an impact point measuring less than half an inch in diameter. The armor didn't just fail, it catastrophically fractured. The penetrator punched through the main glacis plate, through the backing plate behind it, and into the fighting compartment with barely diminished velocity. The tungsten core struck the ammunition storage for the Panther's main gun, detonating 6 75mm rounds in a chain reaction that turned the interior of the tank into a blast furnace. Schulz felt the impact as a massive hammer blow against the Panther's hull. The tank's internal pressure spiked violently, rupturing his eardrums and slamming him against the commander's cupola with bone-breaking force. Smoke, not the grey cordite smoke from the gun firing, but thick black smoke from burning propellant and hydraulic fluid, erupted from every hatch and vision port. His gunner Becker simply vanished, consumed by the ammunition detonation before his nervous system could register pain. The loader, Obergefreiter Kurt Mesmer, was blown through the turret's open hatch by the blast overpressure, his body a scorched ruin. Schulz, protected partially by the commander's cupola and positioned higher in the turret, retained enough consciousness to scramble out of the burning tank. His driver and radio operator, trapped in the forward hull, died within seconds as fire consumed the fighting compartment. The entire sequence, from the Sherman's shot to the Panther's catastrophic destruction, had taken perhaps 8 seconds. Schulz collapsed in the dirt 20 meters from his burning Panther, his mind struggling to comprehend what had happened. The tank that had survived Kursk, that had deflected countless American shells, that represented the pinnacle of German armored engineering, had been killed by a single frontal shot from a Sherman. The tactical implications were beyond catastrophic. They were existential. Through smoke and shock, Schulz watched the American Sherman that had destroyed his Panther continue advancing. Its commander, visible in the turret, was already scanning for additional targets. 2 more Panthers from Schulz's platoon, positioned 200 meters to his right, fired almost simultaneously at the American formation. Both rounds struck Shermans at approximately 1,100 meters. One Sherman exploded in the familiar manner Schulz had witnessed dozens of times, its turret lifting slightly as ammunition detonated. The second Sherman, however, absorbed the hit on its frontal slope and returned fire within 15 seconds. The responding American shot, another HVAP round, though Schulz couldn't know this, penetrated the second Panther's frontal armor with the same devastating efficiency. The Panther erupted in flames, its crew's escape hatch blowing open as the loader attempted to bail out. The man made it halfway through the hatch before secondary ammunition detonations killed him. The third Panther, commanded by Schulz's company executive officer, Oberleutnant Stefan Hoffmann, immediately reversed from its position and withdrew at maximum speed. Hoffmann had survived the Eastern Front through an acute sense of when tactical situations became untenable. 3 Panthers destroyed in less than 2 minutes by frontal Sherman shots constituted evidence that something fundamental had changed. The American advance continued. The Sherman Company, having lost 2 tanks, deployed into line formation and systematically engaged the remaining German defensive positions. The German anti-tank guns, Pak 42nds positioned to support the Panthers, fired at extreme range with minimal effect. American artillery, called in by forward observers traveling with the tank company, began impacting German positions with the terrifying accuracy that characterized American indirect fire support. By 10:15 hours, less than 40 minutes after the engagement began, American forces had breached the German defensive line and were advancing toward Maizi. Schulz, evacuated by German medical personnel who arrived after the American advance bypassed the position, spent the next week in a field hospital near Nancy. His physical injuries, ruptured eardrums, 3 broken ribs, and second-degree burns on his hands and face, would heal. The psychological damage proved more permanent. He had commanded Panthers for 14 months, trusted the vehicle's armor implicitly, built his tactical doctrine around its invulnerability to frontal attack. That certainty had died in 8 seconds of tungsten-penetrated steel. Medical orderlies quietly informed Schulz that he was the only survivor from his platoon's 3 Panthers. 8 men dead, 3 more critically wounded from the follow-on American artillery barrage. The casualties were higher than any single engagement Schulz had experienced on the Eastern Front. The pattern Schulz experienced at Maizi was repeating across the entire Western Front during early September 1944. German armoured units, conducting fighting withdrawals toward the German frontier, encountered American Sherman formations employing HVAP ammunition with increasing frequency and devastating effect. Wehrmacht intelligence officers compiled after-action reports that painted an alarming picture. Panthers were being destroyed frontally at ranges previously considered safe. The American 76mm gun, which German tactical doctrine had rated as only marginally more dangerous than the old 75, was killing Panthers with disturbing regularity. Interrogations of captured American tank crews provided fragmentary information about new ammunition, though many prisoners either didn't know specifics or had been instructed not to discuss technical details. German ordnance experts, presented with fragments recovered from destroyed Panthers, identified the tungsten carbide cores and aluminum ballistic caps. The technical analysis, conducted at proving grounds near Berlin, confirmed what frontline reports indicated. The Americans had developed armor-piercing ammunition capable of defeating Panther frontal armor at combat ranges. The implications for German defensive doctrine were catastrophic. The Panther's tactical value had rested fundamentally on its armor protection. German commanders had accepted the tank's mechanical unreliability, its high fuel consumption, and its expensive production costs, because the armor made individual Panthers worth several Allied tanks in combat. If American Shermans could now kill Panthers frontally, the exchange ratio collapsed. Germany could not replace armored losses at the rate America could produce Shermans. The mathematics of attrition, previously favorable to Germany in tank combat, had inverted completely. Hauptmann Wilhelm Kessler, commanding officer of the 2nd Company, 116th Panzer Division, experienced this new reality during fighting near the Moselle River in mid-September. His company, equipped with 11 Panthers, engaged an American armored battalion advancing along the Metz Road. The engagement began according to established doctrine. Panthers in prepared positions, excellent fields of fire, engagement ranges favoring German optics and gun performance. The American formation, approximately 30 Shermans with infantry support, advanced into the killing ground Kessler had carefully prepared. His Panthers opened fire at 1,300 meters, the opening salvo destroying 4 Shermans in less than a minute. Standard outcome, predictable results. Then the American Shermans, rather than withdrawing or deploying smoke as previous doctrine suggested, charged forward while returning fire. Kessler watched through his binoculars as American 76mm guns engaged his Panthers at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The first American rounds were conventional armor-piercing, sparking off Panther armor without penetrating. But mixed among the standard ammunition were HVAP rounds, identifiable only by their slightly different trajectory and the catastrophic damage they inflicted upon impact. 3 of Kessler's Panthers were destroyed in the first 5 minutes of engagement, each killed by frontal penetrations that should have been impossible. The psychological impact on German crews was immediate and devastating. Tank commanders who had fought with confidence, knowing their armor provided protection against frontal attack, now faced engagements where any hit might penetrate. The tactical initiative, which German doctrine assumed Panthers would control through superior armor and firepower, shifted to American forces, who could now engage frontally without accepting suicidal casualties. Kessler ordered withdrawal after losing 5 Panthers in 12 minutes. His remaining tanks displaced to secondary positions, but the pattern repeated. American Shermans, emboldened by HVAP's effectiveness, pressed attacks with aggression that previous German experience suggested was tactically unsound. Except it wasn't unsound anymore. The mathematics had changed. By late September, German armored formations across the Western Front were implementing revised tactical doctrine that explicitly acknowledged Panther vulnerability to American 76mm fire. New standing orders emphasized engagement at maximum possible range, immediate withdrawal after firing, and avoidance of extended engagements with American armor. These defensive tactics, while reducing losses, also surrendered the operational initiative completely. German commanders found themselves unable to conduct the mobile defense and aggressive counterattacks that had characterized Wehrmacht doctrine. The psychological shift among German tank crews was profound. Schulz, returned to duty in early October with a replacement Panther, found his new crew's morale critically damaged before they'd fired a shot in anger. His loader, a 19-year-old conscript named Private Franz Weber, openly questioned whether Panthers could survive against American armor. Weber had heard stories from survivors describing Sherman rounds penetrating Panthers as easily as Panthers had once killed Shermans. The crew's confidence, that essential psychological component of effective combat performance, had been shattered by reports of armor that no longer protected and tactics that no longer worked. The tactical doctrine revisions, combined with declining fuel supplies and mechanical attrition, reduced German armoured effectiveness dramatically during autumn 1944. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Meanwhile, American forces, recognizing HVAP's strategic value, increased production allocation and expanded distribution. By October, 76mm Sherman companies were receiving 8 HVAP rounds per tank, double the initial allocation. Dedicated armor-piercing ammunition became standard combat load, with HVAP reserved specifically for heavy German armor encounters. Training programs, conducted at replacement depots in France and England, emphasized HVAP employment techniques. Gunners learned the ammunition's ballistic characteristics, optimal engagement ranges, and proper aim points for maximum penetration probability. The technical advantages HVAP provided were amplified by tactical doctrine that leveraged the ammunition's capabilities effectively. American tank companies developed engagement drills specifically designed around HVAP. Sherman platoons would advance aggressively toward German positions, accepting hits from German tanks that would previously have forced withdrawal. The psychological confidence that HVAP provided allowed American crews to close to optimal engagement ranges where their numerical superiority and ammunition supply could overwhelm German defenders. Staff Sergeant Thomas Chen, whose crew had received HVAP in August, engaged Panthers 3 more times during September and October. His after-action reports, preserved in 2nd Armored Division records, document the evolution of American tactical confidence. In August, Chen's crew approached Panther engagements with dread, understanding that survival depended on perfect execution and considerable luck. By October, Chen was engaging Panthers almost casually, confident that HVAP gave his Sherman realistic probability of killing German heavy armor frontally. The transformation from victim to peer combatant occurred over 8 weeks, enabled entirely by 3 inches of tungsten carbide. The strategic impact of HVAP ammunition extended beyond individual tank engagements to shape operational outcomes across the Western Front. German commanders, unable to use Panthers aggressively for counterattacks or mobile defense, found themselves conducting static defensive warfare that played to every American advantage. Superior American artillery, air support, logistics, and numerical superiority ground down German defensive positions systematically. The rapid advance that characterized September and October 1944, when Allied forces reached the German frontier and liberated most of France, was enabled partly by German logistical collapse and partly by the neutralization of Germany's qualitative advantage in armor. HVAP hadn't made Shermans superior to Panthers in technical specifications. The Panther retained better armor, a more powerful gun, and superior optics. But HVAP made Shermans adequate, and adequacy combined with massive numerical superiority was decisive. The Battle of Aachen in October 1944 provided stark demonstration of HVAP's operational impact. German defenders, including elements of the 116th Panzer Division, employed Panthers in urban combat to defend the first major German city threatened by Allied advance. American forces attacking into Aachen included multiple Sherman battalions equipped with full HVAP allocations. The street fighting, conducted at extremely close ranges where German armor advantages should have been overwhelming, resulted in surprisingly equitable exchange ratios. American after-action analysis determined that Sherman casualties during the Aachen battle were approximately 40% lower than statistical models predicted based on previous urban combat against German heavy armor. The reduction correlated directly with HVAP employment, which allowed Shermans to engage Panthers in close-range urban environments without accepting catastrophic losses. By November 1944, as autumn rains turned European battlefields into mud and both sides prepared for winter operations, HVAP ammunition had become standard issue throughout American armored formations in Europe. Production bottlenecks had been resolved, tungsten allocation increased, and manufacturing quality improved to the point where the ammunition performed reliably under field conditions. German intelligence, through interrogations and recovered documentation, had developed reasonable understanding of HVAP's capabilities. But understanding the problem and solving it were different challenges entirely. German ordnance experts explored various countermeasures. Proposals included thickening Panther frontal armor, modifying armor angles, and developing specialized armor treatments to defeat tungsten penetrators. None proved feasible given Germany's collapsing industrial capacity and resource shortages. The Panther F variant, which featured redesigned frontal armor intended partly to address HVAP threats, never entered mass production. Germany's armored warfare strategy, built around qualitative superiority compensating for numerical inferiority, had been invalidated by American materials science and industrial capacity. The winter of 1944–45 brought Germany's final major offensive in the West. The Ardennes Campaign, commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge, German planning for the offensive explicitly acknowledged that Panther and Tiger tanks could no longer dominate American Shermans as they had during summer fighting. Tactical directives emphasized surprise, momentum, and avoiding extended tank battles where American numerical and now qualitative advantages would prove decisive. The offensive, launched on December 16th, achieved substantial initial surprise and penetrated deeply into American positions. But even during the offensive's most successful phase, German armored forces encountered Sherman formations equipped with HVAP that inflicted losses German planners had not anticipated. Oberleutnant Werner Schulz, commanding a replacement Panther in the Ardennes offensive, survived 3 separate engagements with American armor during the battle. Each encounter reinforced lessons learned at Maizi in September. American Shermans no longer withdrew when encountering Panthers. They engaged frontally, often at ranges under 800 meters where HVAP effectiveness was nearly guaranteed. Schulz's crew destroyed 2 Shermans during a firefight near Bastogne, but lost their Panther when an American HVAP round penetrated the turret ring, killing the gunner and loader instantly. Schulz and his driver escaped the burning tank, the second time Schulz had survived a Panther's destruction by American fire. Statistical analysis of tank combat during the Battle of the Bulge, conducted by Army operational research groups, revealed the complete transformation HVAP had achieved. American Sherman losses in tank versus tank combat were approximately 30% of what similar engagements had cost in July and August. German Panther losses were correspondingly higher, creating exchange ratios that Germany's limited production capacity could not sustain. The Ardennes offensive consumed Germany's last operational reserves of armor, losses made catastrophically worse by HVAP's effectiveness. By January 1945, as Allied forces compressed the Ardennes salient and prepared for final offensives into Germany, HVAP ammunition had become so commonplace that American tankers used it routinely rather than hoarding it for desperate situations. The psychological journey from August's 4 precious rounds per tank to January's routine employment reflected both increased production and complete confidence in the ammunition's effectiveness. The final campaigns of the European War, from the Rhine crossings through Germany's collapse in May 1945, saw HVAP employed thousands of times in combat. German armoured resistance, increasingly sporadic as fuel shortages and mechanical attrition reduced operational tank numbers, posed minimal strategic threat. When Panthers or Tigers did appear, American gunners engaged them with HVAP rounds almost reflexively. The desperate intensity of earlier encounters had been replaced by professional competence and overwhelming material superiority. Staff Sergeant Thomas Chen, who had received the first HVAP rounds in August 1944, survived the war and participated in the occupation of Germany. In May 1945, he examined a destroyed Panther outside Munich, noting the distinctive penetration crater from an HVAP round that had punched through the frontal glacis plate. Chen reflected that the tungsten penetrator responsible for that kill had travelled less than 3 inches through German armour, but had traversed the distance between terror and confidence, between inadequacy and sufficiency, between August's desperation and May's victory. The post-war analysis of HVAP ammunition's impact produced consensus among military historians and weapons analysts. According to studies published by the United States Army Armor School at Fort Knox, HVAP represented the most significant tactical innovation in American armored warfare during the European campaign. The ammunition hadn't made American tanks superior to German heavy armor in technical specifications. Panthers retained better guns, better armor, and better optics throughout the war, but HVAP had made American tanks adequate, and adequacy multiplied by industrial capacity and tactical competence proved overwhelming. The technical achievement represented by HVAP, developing effective tungsten carbide penetrators and manufacturing them at scale, demonstrated American materials science and industrial capability, but the ammunition's strategic impact derived from timing. HVAP arrived precisely when American armored forces needed it most, when Panther and Tiger tanks threatened to make Sherman casualties unsustainable. The 90 seconds between when a Panther gunner acquired a Sherman target and when that Sherman could fire back with HVAP had represented the entire margin of German tactical advantage. In those 90 seconds, German crews had to identify the target, range it accurately, fire, observe the hit, and reload for a second shot if necessary. American crews in that same window had to survive the initial German shot, hopefully on frontal. Armor thick enough to defeat standard armor-piercing rounds, acquire the German tank, and fire HVAP with enough accuracy to penetrate. The mathematics were brutally simple. German tanks still killed Shermans more reliably than Shermans killed German tanks. But HVAP narrowed the gap from catastrophic to manageable. For Oberleutnant Werner Schulz, who survived the war and spent 5 years in Allied prisoner-of-war camps, the memory of that September morning at Maizi remained vivid decades later. In interviews conducted during the 1980s for German military history projects, Schulz described the psychological impact of watching his invulnerable Panther penetrated and destroyed by a single Sherman shot. The confidence that had sustained him through 14 months of combat, the certainty that German armor superiority would enable survival through skill and aggression, died in those 8 seconds. Everything afterward, the Ardennes offensive, the fighting retreat into Germany, the final desperate defense of the Reich, occurred in the shadow of that fundamental revelation. The Panthers weren't invulnerable anymore. American industry, ingenuity, and determination had found an answer, a 3-inch tungsten penetrator that negated 2 years of German armored dominance. The story of HVAP ammunition, of German tankers having 90 seconds before Sherman 76mm guns fired tungsten-cored rounds straight through Panther frontal armor, exemplifies how technological innovation can transform warfare's material and psychological dimensions simultaneously. The rounds themselves were unremarkable-looking objects, slender projectiles distinguished only by aluminum caps and slightly different weight distribution. Yet those projectiles carried within them the concentration of American industrial capacity, scientific expertise, and strategic determination to overcome German qualitative advantages through innovation and production scale. The veterans who fired HVAP rounds in combat, men like Staff Sergeant Chen who watched tungsten penetrators punch through armor that had previously seemed invulnerable, understood that warfare turned not just on grand strategies or massive operations. Sometimes victory came from small innovations that arrived at exactly the right historical moment. From materials science that solved problems tanks couldn't, from 3 inches of tungsten carbide traveling at 3,400 feet per second straight through the myths of invulnerability. In the end, the 90 seconds that German tankers had to engage Shermans, before facing HVAP counterfire, represented the entire margin between German tactical doctrine and American material reality. And when those 90 seconds expired, when the tungsten penetrators began impacting Panther armor with physics that German engineering couldn't defeat, the outcome of armored warfare on the Western Front was effectively decided, not through dramatic battles or brilliant generalship, but through the quiet revolution of better ammunition arriving in sufficient quantities at the necessary moment. The legacy persists in every modern armor-piercing projectile, in every tungsten penetrator, in the fundamental principle that HVAP demonstrated with devastating clarity. In warfare, material science matters as much as courage, production capacity matters as much as tactics, and sometimes the difference between defeat and victory measures exactly 3 inches of tungsten carbide traveling at supersonic velocity through steel that was supposed to be invulnerable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.